Story 1. According to my high school mathematics students, they do not need geometry at all because they are going to work for their uncle's construction company. Story 2. Fashion design. It turns out that creating cute outfits requires geometry and pain. Story 3. I once used differential calculus to figure out how many bushels of soybeans were in flat storage because we did not have a reliable way to measure it. I calculated 35,000, and when it was emptied it measured 33,800. I will take about 97% calculated compared to actual all day long. Story 4. I would never want to get into a geometry battle with a carpenter. When I want to see where my intelligence abruptly ends, I cut molding on a miter saw. It is amazing how I can measure something a dozen times and still cut it backwards. Story 5. Culinary. Scaling recipes requires using ratios. For example, a recipe makes 12 cookies, but you are serving 17 people. The recipe calls for 2 cups of flour for 12 cookies. How much flour is needed for 17 cookies? Or, if you want to bake cookies and have 4 sticks of butter, how many cookies can you make when you scale the recipe to the butter you have? Story 6. Bartending, counting thousands of dollars, performing inventory, and other related tasks. Story 7. Social media manager. You think it's vibes and memes until you're calculating engagement rates like it's rocket science. Story 8. Game development is not just some mathematics. It is entirely mathematics. Story 9. Carpentry requires a great deal of math, from knowing how to cut angles to understanding the limits of weight-bearing supports. Story 10. Mechanics, electrical, and hydraulic diagnostics involve a lot of math. Road building. Figuring out how many yards of gravel you need for a job is critical. Story 11. Interior design involves a lot of math. Space planning, scaling furniture, and even budgeting require solid math skills to create beautiful spaces. Story 12. One of my geometry students told me he did not need math because he was going to work with his father in construction. I had a good chuckle about that. Story 13. Sewing, especially quilting, involves a lot of math. Story 14. Dance teacher and choreographer. Large portions of my days are spent counting music, figuring out how many counts of 8 are in a section. If one move takes a certain number of counts and another takes more, I must allocate counts for transitions. If the dancers cannot travel far enough in that time, I adjust by moving a phrase earlier in the piece and recalculating the counts. Then there is the geometry. I plan dancers' paths and formations so they can move from one spot to another without colliding. By slightly changing a dancer's angle and altering a shape, they can pass through the created gaps as long as their timing is precise. Story 15. Graphic design involves scaling images and working with margins and type sizes. Before computers, we had to calculate how much space set text would occupy on the page. Story 16. Many students enroll in an astronomy course at university expecting no mathematics, but astronomy relies heavily on mathematics. Story 17. They all do, technically. If you have ever considered how much time you have left in your day to complete your tasks, congratulations. You have just done math. Story 18. Oh my God. I have been waiting for a question like this. Ahem. Yes. Story 19. People generally know that mathematics is involved in nursing, but they would be surprised by what kinds of mathematics are used and when and where it is applied. Story 20. My sister is a merchandise planner, and there is so much math. Apparently, most of the students in her program drop out because they cannot get past the math courses required. They had expected the program to focus on fashion and beauty rather than on the realities of business management, such as forecasting and consumer data analytics. Story 21. Screenwriting is not complicated mathematics, but it is mathematics nonetheless. You must work within production budgets and constraints. Story 22. Baking. Yes, that cake is a math problem disguised as dessert. Story 23. The priesthood, specifically during the preparation and administration of communion. Story 24. Surprisingly, game design and development are closely related. You would not believe how many people are surprised by this. Story 25. It seems many jobs use math up to geometry. I wonder how many require algebra 2 or beyond. Story 26. I do not know about career plans, but studying psychology involves a large amount of mathematics, specifically statistics. Story 27. Almost all marketing and advertising is math now. Even television ads, which used to be about awareness and generating demand, are now measured using lift analysis and holdout testing. Story 28. This comment section makes me happy. I am a mathematics major, and I love seeing that mathematics is everywhere and appreciating its importance. Story 29. Almost everything becomes a business at some point. I have spent years as a punk electronic musician. I still have to do my books. Story 30. This is a completely different topic, but I have to say it. People think programming requires math, yet most programmers never use it. Story 31. Cooking. Ratios, timing, and fractions decide whether you impress or cry. Story 32. Environmental sciences, ecology. Hear me out. People think it's just basic math like statistics, but if you are a field scientist, which I was, it's important to understand dynamical systems theory, operator theory, stochastic processes, and calculus. I took all the calculus classes in college. All the fun ended when collecting field data was over and the math and reports started. Story 33. Cooking at a professional level involves ratios, temperatures, timing, and scaling recipes. It is constant math disguised as creativity. Story 34. Fucking pottery. Shrinkage, glaze calculations, mold making, and so much more. That's not even beginning to cover the business side of things, such as calculating commissions, wholesale prices, and taxes. Story 35. Exercise and fitness. Calories, macronutrients, and micronutrients, maximum oxygen uptake, converting kilograms to pounds, calculating % 1 repetition maximum, body mass index, body composition percentages, measuring circumference, angles and line of pull, and more. This does not even include the more advanced scientific topics, such as biomechanics and biochemistry. Story 36. I'm in sales and somehow keep having to break out my 9th grade geometry. Story 37. Most careers in computer programming do not require special knowledge of mathematics. Being good at mathematics is helpful, and some specialized areas of software engineering require advanced mathematics, but the overwhelming majority of programmers use simple wrappers around complex mathematical algorithms that others developed and refined years or even decades ago. Story 38. Farming. Our son said he was interested in going into the field, which he had never shown an interest in at all while growing up. When we asked him why, he said it was because he did not want to have to do math. He was struggling with math at the time. Story 39. Every career requires math because you must decide whether the pay is adequate and whether you need a raise. Story 40. Selling cars. Total price, trade-in value, monthly payments, and loan terms. Story 41. A good psychologist has a deep understanding of statistical theory. Story 42. In retail, you would be surprised how often you encounter people who cannot count change. Story 43. I am an aviation mechanic, airframe and power plant mechanic, and I have to ballpark algebra about 40 times a day just giving updates to scheduling and project management. I have to roughly figure tariffs for quotes, remember roughly what a part costs from the original equipment manufacturer, and do back of the eyelids math when dealing with the customer to include the non-original equipment manufacturer. Markup without setting up my salesperson for a conniption fit if I misremember. Then I quickly read off vernier measuring equipment and figure percentages while also remembering tolerance bands on the specific airframe I am working on. While I am doing this, I also have to calculate transit math from Wichita, Apopka, Marana, or Dallas and try to guess the freight charge for hotshot, air freight, or parcel post. The sales and quote math could upset a customer. The repair math could cost me the customer, their family, my license, and my freedom. 1/3 of my current mostly full work notebook is part numbers, who did what the boss wants, and back shop contact numbers. 2/3 of it is detailed notes like, Textron shows this part is $3,007 with core exchange due in 7 days from origination. It will take 8 man-hours to remove the old part, and it is currently 53 degrees and rainy with a further low-pressure front moving in. At 60 miles per hour, the hot shot from San Antonio needs 17 driving hours. So if it is a one-man operation, it will be here at 1700 Tuesday after 11 hours driving. 10 hours break, 7 hours driving, plus 3 hours for traffic, restroom breaks, and fuel. At $3 per gallon of diesel. And $1.50 per mile, plus brokerage and tax, that is a $4,800 part that will get here Wednesday midday at the earliest, and the core needs to be drained, capped, and tagged Tuesday before 2 p.m. or it becomes an $11,800 part due to separate deadhead fee, origination, and brokerage to get it to Wichita before the deadline. Also 6-foot linear of sealer at $78 per 6 ounces, but it is my apprentice sealing, so it will use the whole 6 ounces, so better order 12 to overseal that antenna too. At least 3 of those magnetic particle inspection bolts are going to be damaged, so that is another $150 and the hours to drill out covering hardware, and the cost of replacement is another $480. At the end of all that, I am reading off Google Translate what I think is Portuguese for, we can be 90% on a next Wednesday wheels up, but it will be $13,900 if you want that sticky cross flow valve replaced. I work in one of the easier trades for math to money. Machinists make less and have to recite the deep magic to the witch who wrote it. Story 44. Training in all areas of academic psychology is heavily, if not exclusively, quantitative. Many psychologists have made major contributions to applied probability and statistics. Even if you are a therapist or a clinical psychologist, you need to be at least somewhat versed in quantitative methodology to understand the literature and update your practices. Imagine if physicians never kept up with advances in medicine. Therapists and clinical psychologists who do not read and critically evaluate developments in mental health care remain confined to the limited understanding of their training era and may not be prepared to offer the best possible care to people living with mental illness. Story 45. As an infantry officer, I would use trigonometric functions to estimate where to shift and cease machine gun fire as it relates to a maneuvering assault unit. Story 46. I am a professional poker player. It is not all just staring into your opponent's eyes and reading their soul. You need a strong understanding of probability theory to do well. Story 47. I just want to say that much of accounting is not mathematics. There are numbers, but it is not arithmetic or algebra in many cases. Story 48. Graphic design depends on what you do. If it involves anything physical, it requires mathematics. Story 49. In the aerospace industry, grinding is used to create or modify internal engine parts that require precise dimensions. Story 50. Floral design requires calculating the cost of every stem, vase, and hour of labor to determine price points for what we sell. Story 51. Ironically, labor jobs that do not require a degree usually involve complex math. Story 52. Infantry personnel, and especially snipers, rely heavily on mathematics. A sniper weaponizes math by calculating the ballistic trajectory of a bullet while accounting for target movement, wind speed, humidity, and other factors. As a regular infantry soldier, you manage supplies, estimate distances accurately for navigation, and fill out range cards. Even mundane tasks, such as setting up a roster for who is on picket duty, require basic arithmetic. Story 53. Surprisingly, the Department of Veterans Affairs involves a lot of math. I did not know that before I started, but I do math all day long in pension management. Story 54. During tower erection, I used the Pythagorean theorem to help the tower crew determine how much guy wire they needed. Story 55. Many public defenders enter the work because they do not have to track billable hours like private defense attorneys. However, determining offender scores, mandatory sentences, legal financial obligations, and credit for time for good behavior requires substantial calculation. If your office tries to reduce caseloads based on hours worked, you may still have to track equivalent billable hours. Story 56. As a principal and assistant principal, I spend much of my time making schedules, calculating hours, balancing teacher workloads, and creating and tracking budgets. I am not a math teacher and did not expect to spend so much time working with spreadsheets, pencils, and calculators. Story 57. My former partner wanted to be a social media manager but kept getting upset that her communications and marketing major required math classes. Turns out there is more to the job than just tweeting pictures. You have to keep track of data and trends. Story 58. I never understood why computer science majors had to take so many math classes. To be honest, I still do not entirely understand it. Story 59. Logistics involves a lot of mathematics. It includes calculating shipping dimensions, costs, and delivery times. Story 60. Film and video editing requires doing math in base 30 or base 24 depending on the frame rate you use. Story 61. Air traffic control. Spacing aircraft for miles in trail or time metering. When 15 aircraft converge on a larger airport like Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and each requires 20 miles of separation, you must calculate speeds to achieve the required spacing. Example: Aircraft 1 flies 300 knots. Aircraft 2 flies 280 knots and is 30 miles ahead of Aircraft 1. How long until they are 20 miles apart? Story 62. Many kids ask me how to get into making video games. They look appalled when I tell them to study mathematics, especially geometry. Story 63. Animating, figuring out the timing of movements relative to the frame rate. Story 64. I had my first light bulb moment. Oh my gosh, I'm actually using calculus at age 40 when I was demoing a dashboard at work that tracked backup activity across our estate. The big boss wanted to know how much actual data was being moved each day. I already had a graph plotting throughput at 5-minute intervals, and he explained that the area under that graph, the integral, is roughly how much data is moved overall. I finally understood something I had spent many years learning by rote to pass tests instead of understanding its application. Story 65. I had my first light bulb moment. Oh my goodness, I was actually using calculus at age 40 when I was demoing a dashboard at work that tracked backup activity across our estate. The boss wanted to know how much actual data was being moved each day. I already had a graph plotting throughput at 5-minute intervals, and he told me that the area under that graph, the integral, is roughly how much data is moved overall. I finally understood something I had learned by rote for years to pass tests without understanding the application. Cool stuff. Story 66. Graphic design involves a lot more math than you would think. Story 67. Music, I think, depending on what branch of the field you go into. Story 68. Two-dimensional animation requires a great deal of mental calculation and projection, which is often underrated, especially when animating the shaking motion of buttocks and breasts in Eastern animation. Story 69. Bus driving. The ticket machine does all the math until it does not, or you make a mistake. Story 70. Hairstylist, including braiding, must have knowledge of angles and geometry. Story 71. I have become very good at mentally dividing and subtracting fractions while working in a steel fabrication shop. Story 72. Towing cars and recovering them after a major accident. Story 73. I remember a guy in high school angrily shouting to his math teacher, "I don't need this. I am going to be a truck driver." There can also be quite a bit of math in graphic design, illustration, and art. Story 74. Any career involves math. You trade your time for money and must justify the value you provide to whoever pays you. A career is literally finding the value of X. Story 75. I have the opposite experience. People think computers are all mathematics. For those designing or coding them, they are, but I am a system and network administrator and I never use math. Even when I need to configure internet protocol settings, we have automated tools for that. Often it is basic, such as a network mask of 255.255.255.0, so there is no need to calculate. Of course, I understand the theory and binary and hexadecimal concepts, but why bother when you have a calculator? Story 76. Economics. It feels like I'm getting a bachelor's degree in mathematics. I can't. Story 77. In psychology, questionnaires often ask you to rate X and Y from 1 to 5. Yes, you have to calculate using the numbers afterward. Story 78. Theater. I'm a stagehand, and that shit requires geometry, engineering, electrical calculations, fucking physics, optics, frequencies, and figuring out how to safely hoist thousands of pounds in human beings. I have so many equations to memorize. Story 79. The post office is particularly important in the United Kingdom. This may vary in other countries. It is not just about postal services. I do not know how long ago, but post offices began handling cash transactions. If you need to check your balance, withdraw or deposit cash without a fee, or exchange it for another currency such as dollars or euros when an automated teller machine is out of order. The post office is your best option. With many bank branches scheduled to close in a couple of years, it may become the only option. The office where I work part-time is small and cannot afford a money counting machine, so arithmetic and steady hands are required, especially when customers want withdrawn cash in specific denominations, for example £100 in 420s, 110 and 15 with the remainder in coins. Not to mention, inventory is so complex that it takes half a day. Inventory tasks include recording currency and stamps, check payments, and checking for any rejected postage labels. Story 80. Long-range shooting is essentially weaponized math and physics. Story 81. Precise grinding of angles to achieve desired submillimeter dimensions requires many sign calculations. Story 82. Firefighting. Calculate friction loss for different hose diameters, lengths, and flow rates. Determine the force applied to tools and equipment during extrication and other rescue operations. Perform medication dosage calculations. Story 83. Graphic design involves extensive mathematics and requires expertise in a wide range of software. Story 84. While playing video games, Technoblade used the Pythagorean theorem and ancient Chinese tactics to win the 100,000 duel against Dream. Story 85. The way some of my students talk about building work. If you are just the person doing all the labor, you may not need it. But when I sold wholesale building supplies, most builders would do the maths right then and there to work out how much material they needed. Story 86. Being a farmer means you have to get the seeds, find the area of your plot, determine when to plant, and calculate the return on investment for certain products. Story 87. Computer science often surprises people. They expect there to be math, but they do not understand just how much. Story 88. Social work. Actually, it contains an average amount of mathematics. We just have to redo the equations so often because we are bad at them. It is quantity, not quality. Story 89. Animation. Frame rates, aspect ratios, frame sizes, color bit depth, timing, and spacing. Underneath the hood, every piece of animation software is mathematics. Story 90. Fitness, especially the exercise science side of it, includes expected measures like waist-to-hip ratios and body mass index calculations, but it also involves significant physics and biology components. Story 91. Graphic design, especially if you work with physical books. Turns out that paint has weight. Story 92. I'm thinking about the salon. I need to measure those products correctly. Story 93. As a chef, scaling recipes to specific quantities and converting between measurements is why it is much simpler to use scientific measurements. I also calculate recipe costs, food cost percentages, and labor percentages. Story 94. Back in college, my best friend switched majors from mathematics to art because he wanted to follow his dream of becoming an animator. He made it, and he tells me he uses more mathematics now than he ever did in college, designing algorithms for all the computer-generated imagery used today. Story 95. Honestly, working in construction is much more math than you would think. Before light detection and ranging technology, we used differential equations and numerical modeling in earthworks to perform most of our quantity takeoffs and estimates. Story 96. Law. There is a running joke that lawyers are not good at math, but if you work in tax, human resources, labor and employment, real estate, personal injury, insurance, defense, property, torts, contracts, compliance, and so on, then you are dealing with math and numbers. Story 97. Truck driving requires you to keep track of driving hours, mileage, brake time, and the distance between you and another vehicle, which is measured in seconds rather than feet or meters. Story 98. I'm a hairstylist. Someone recently called me creative. I said no, I'm not creative. I use the other side of my brain. Is hair creative, or is it geometry? Story 99. In pest control, you must mix pesticides with water, and different products have different mixing rates. Application of pesticides is governed by rules for the amount per square foot that must be documented for each treatment. Large commercial accounts may be audited by outside agencies that review reports to ensure proper amounts were used. State agencies can also issue fines for misapplications. Story 100. I would say project management. Budgets, time estimates, percentages, resource allocation. It's basically math with meetings. Story 101. I misread your question, but accounting is not math even though everyone thinks it is. Story 102. I was the high school student who believed math did not matter because I thought I was better suited to a blue-collar trade. My first adult job was on large-scale civil construction projects involving mostly cylindrical structures. I will never forget the day I watched a supervisor masterfully use trigonometry to lay out heavy piping before assembly. The rest of my time in that field involved measuring everything: center pins and radius calculations, surveying and calculating elevations from benchmarks, weight and measurement conversions including converting decimal feet, and reading hoisting load charts. Math seemed unnecessary in school, but seeing its real-world applications revealed its practical value. Story 103. Everyone. Want a mortgage? Do you buy down the rate with points? Welcome to the real world. It's all a word problem with missing and false information. Story 104. I'm a wildlife biologist. The majority of my days are filled with statistics and mathematics. It's a sad reality. Story 105. Cooking, measuring, timing, and scaling recipes is serious math in the kitchen. Story 106. Architecture is creative, but without mathematics a building will collapse. Story 107. My work is in mechanical engineering, specifically heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Contractors often tell me our designs will not work. When I ask them to send their calculations so we can compare numbers, they say they do not have any. I rely on mathematics rather than the gut feelings of contractors. Story 108. Social sciences, sociology. You expect to work with people, but you end up doing a lot of statistics. Story 109. Music production may not be much, but it definitely matters. Story 110. It turns out tattoo artists need much more math than people think to achieve perfect lines, spacing, and symmetry. Story 111. Information technology. I remember when I was in high school, my teachers criticized me because I wanted to study information technology after graduation, saying I was just avoiding mathematics. They were all wrong. Story 112. Copywriting. We analyze metrics to gauge how well copy converts, how often it is opened, and how it increases return on investment. My agency bills clients based on hours worked for each client. Story 113. Clinical psychologist, statistics and arithmetic for psychological testing and evaluation scoring. Story 114. In college, I worked for the athletics department. We often had to paint practice fields for soccer, football, and lacrosse on open grass. It does not sound difficult at first, but it is actually quite hard to freehand a whole football field and make it perfectly square without using math, specifically the Pythagorean theorem. Because all the fields were rectangles and a rectangle is two right triangles, we could find the four corners of the field using the Pythagorean theorem and the 3-4-5 rule. You can make a right triangle of any size if its sides are multiples of 3, 4, and 5. So if we made a right triangle on the field with sides of length 150 feet, 200 feet, and 250 feet, and then flipped the triangle across the hypotenuse and repeated the process, we could locate the four corners of a 150 by 200 foot field and be confident they would form four right angles. I always thought that was a cool use of a theorem, especially as a math major in college. Story 115. I would say that almost every career involves mathematics at some level. Story 116. Victorian literature professor. They still buy groceries, pay taxes, and vote. Math matters for literally everyone. Edit. I love that every other note in this thread is along the same lines. Nobody mentions engineer, architect, doctor, or scientist. This entire thread lists artist, musician, designer. Everyone needs math. Story 117. I follow an incredibly talented crochet pattern maker. One of her early posts explains how her math degree helps her create patterns. I'm mad because she's right. She's brilliant, and her patterns really work. Story 118. I never used calculus at work, but as an industrial electrician and maintenance engineer, I used trigonometry a lot, especially in layout and fabrication. I used geometry and algebra to a lesser extent, and there was also the budget and accounting part of the job. There is a lot of math in some blue-collar jobs. Story 119. Truck driving is not about pickup trucks like the Dodge Ram. Think instead of heavy trucks such as Peterbilt and Scania and similar models. There is a lot of paperwork and calculations. Drivers must ensure their loads are within legal weight limits, which requires careful planning and attention. However, only a small percentage of truck drivers know how to do this correctly. Story 120. Marketing. I perform percentage change calculations every day. Story 121. Tax preparation. Basic personal tax returns involve entering numbers on the forms and letting the software do the calculations. Complex business returns and returns for high-income, high-net-worth individuals require reading and understanding the regulations to determine the most favorable application, then letting the software perform the calculations. Story 122. Economics. Few people I met in the first year of college chose this course because it was popular and they thought it did not require studying mathematics. Story 123. Occupational therapy includes measuring for wheelchairs and performing home modifications such as installing rails and ramps. Story 124. My dad was a bricklayer. I was struggling with 10th grade math and was surprised to learn that he is an expert in trigonometry and geometric transformations. It makes sense because construction involves a lot of angles. Story 125. The older I have gotten, the more I have come to this realization. Everything is math, and some people are better at grasping it than others. Story 126. Researchers in artificial intelligence who receive million-dollar offers from Meta are top-notch mathematicians. Story 127. Come to think of it, I cannot name a single one that does not. Story 128. Sewing, geometry, and trigonometry, along with basic mathematics. Story 129. Almost everything in the arts requires some form of mathematical skill. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.